When I followed my wife to that restaurant, I thought I'd catch her cheating. I just didn't expect the woman who would change my life to be sitting 3 tables away. Looking back now, the night everything changed started like any other quiet Tuesday. My wife stood in front of the hallway mirror adjusting her earrings while I sat on the couch pretending to scroll through my phone. The soft yellow light from the lamp made the apartment feel warm, almost peaceful, but something about the moment felt slightly off. It had been that way for a while. Small things at first. She had started bringing her phone everywhere with her, even to the bathroom. When messages popped up, she would tilt the screen away without thinking. And whenever I casually asked who she was talking to, her answers were quick. A little too quick. Just work stuff. Just a friend. Nothing big enough to accuse someone over. Nothing solid enough to confront. But enough to plant a quiet doubt in the back of my mind. That night she turned toward me, slipping on her coat. "I'm meeting a coworker for dinner," she said casually. "I might be a little late." I nodded like it was completely normal. "Okay," I replied. She gave me a small smile, polite, distant, then grabbed her purse and headed for the door. A few seconds later the apartment fell silent after it closed behind her. I stared at the blank TV screen for a long time. My brain kept trying to convince me I was overthinking everything. That relationships go through phases. That people get busy. But there was another voice too. A quieter one. The kind that whispers instead of shouting. Something isn't right. 10 minutes later, before I had fully decided what I was doing, I was already grabbing my keys. I told myself I wasn't following her. I just needed clarity. The night air outside was cool and still as I got into my car. My hands felt slightly shaky when I started the engine. I kept a careful distance as I drove behind her across town, trying not to look like someone doing exactly what I was doing. Every red light stretched my nerves tighter. Every turn made my heart beat a little faster. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant downtown, one of those places with soft golden lights glowing through large windows and quiet music drifting out whenever the door opened. I parked across the street. For a moment I just sat there. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I watched her step out of the car. She checked her phone. Then she walked inside. Simple. Normal. Nothing dramatic. And yet my chest felt heavy. Because I realized something in that moment. If I walked in after her, my life might change forever. Either I would feel like an idiot for doubting my wife. Or I would see something I could never unsee. The restaurant door opened again as another couple walked inside, laughter drifting faintly across the street. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat there, staring at the entrance. Part of me wanted to drive away. To pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of me already knew the truth was waiting behind those glass doors. And whether I was ready or not, I needed to see it for myself. For a long moment, I just sat there in the car. The restaurant's golden light spilled onto the sidewalk, warm and inviting, the kind of place couples usually went for quiet dinners and long conversations. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I wasn't really aware of them anymore. My mind was stuck somewhere between hope and dread. Maybe she really was meeting a coworker. Maybe I was about to embarrass myself for no reason. I exhaled slowly, opened the car door, and stepped out. Each step toward the restaurant felt heavier than the last. When I pushed the door open, a soft wave of warmth and the smell of grilled steak and garlic butter washed over me. Low music hummed through the room, mixed with the quiet murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of glasses. It looked normal. Peaceful. For a second I wondered if I had already lost her in the crowd. Then I saw her. She was sitting near the center of the room at a small table by the window. And she wasn't alone. A man sat across from her. Mid-30s maybe. Clean cut. Confident. They were leaning slightly toward each other, close enough that it didn't look like a casual work dinner. I froze where I stood. My chest tightened as I watched them. She laughed at something he said, a soft, relaxed laugh I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Then she reached across the table and touched his arm. Not by accident. Not briefly. Her fingers rested there for a moment in a way that said more than any words could. Something inside my chest quietly cracked. I didn't remember deciding to move, but somehow my feet were already carrying me across the restaurant floor. A few people glanced up as I passed, but I barely noticed. All I could see was that table. And the two people sitting at it. When my wife finally looked up and saw me standing there, the color drained from her face instantly. Her smile disappeared. The man turned in his chair, confusion spreading across his expression. For a moment none of us spoke. The restaurant noise around us seemed to fade into a distant blur. "Hi," I said quietly. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. My wife's lips parted, but no words came out. The man looked between us. "You know each other?" he asked cautiously. I let out a small breath. "She's my wife." The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy. The man pushed his chair back slightly, clearly realizing he had just stepped into something far bigger than he expected. My wife stared down at the table, her hands gripping the stem of her wine glass. "I can explain," she whispered. But the truth was already sitting right there in front of me. No explanation could change what I had just seen. The man stood up awkwardly, muttering something about giving us space before quickly leaving the restaurant. Now it was just the two of us. Across the table. Across what felt like the ruins of our marriage. Finally she looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. "I didn't want you to find out like this." The words landed softly, but they hit harder than anything else could have. Because in that moment, I realized something painful. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been a secret. And secrets like that don't start overnight. Around us, the restaurant slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. But at a table near the corner of the room, someone had been watching the entire scene unfold. A woman. Early 40s maybe. Elegant. Calm. When our eyes met briefly across the room, her expression wasn't curious or judgmental. It was something else. Understanding. For a few minutes after my wife left, I didn't move. I just sat there at the table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The wine glass she had been holding was still half full, a faint red stain on the rim. The candle between us flickered gently, its small flame bending every time the restaurant door opened. Everything around me continued like normal. Waiters moved between tables. Soft music drifted through the room. People laughed, glasses clinked, forks scraped against plates. But inside my chest, everything felt strangely quiet. Like the moment after something breaks. I should have gotten up and left. Gone home. Packed a bag. Called a friend. Instead, I stayed there, numb, watching the candle burn lower. "Hey." The voice was gentle. I looked up. The woman from the corner table was standing beside me. Up close, she looked even more composed than she had from across the room. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived long enough to understand life's messy moments. She gave a small, sympathetic smile. "I hope you don't mind me saying something," she said softly. "I just saw what happened." For a second I wasn't sure what to say. Normally I hated strangers stepping into personal situations. But something about her tone wasn't intrusive. It was careful. Human. "I'm sorry you had to see that," I said. She shook her head lightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through it." The honesty in her voice made my throat tighten unexpectedly. She gestured toward the empty chair. "May I sit for a moment?" I hesitated, then nodded. She sat down across from me, folding her hands loosely on the table. Up close, I noticed small details I hadn't seen earlier, faint laugh lines near her eyes, the soft scent of her perfume, the calm steadiness in the way she looked at people when they spoke. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it breathe. That kind of moment, she said quietly after a while, "It feels unreal at first, doesn't it?" I gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah. Unreal is one word for it." She nodded, as if she understood more than she was saying. "I went through something similar," she added gently. "About 8 years ago." That caught my attention. "My husband," she continued, her voice steady, "thought he was being careful. Turns out he wasn't." There was no bitterness in the way she said it. Just acceptance. I studied her for a moment. "You seem pretty calm about it." She smiled faintly. "I wasn't at the time." That made me smile too, the first genuine smile I had managed all night. We talked for a while after that. About small things at first. Life. Work. How strange it is when the future you imagined suddenly disappears. At some point I realized nearly an hour had passed. And somehow, the crushing weight in my chest had eased just a little. When she finally stood to leave, she paused beside the table. Then, gently, she placed her hand on my forearm. The touch was light, warm, grounding. "Tonight is going to hurt," she said softly. Her eyes met mine, steady and reassuring. "But it won't define the rest of your life." For a moment neither of us moved. Then she gave my arm a small, comforting squeeze before letting go. "Take care of yourself," she added. And just like that, she walked toward the door and disappeared into the night. But somehow, the restaurant didn't feel quite as empty anymore. The weeks after that night felt strange. Life didn't stop, even though part of me expected it to. The paperwork for the separation started quietly. Friends asked questions I didn't always feel like answering. The apartment felt emptier, quieter, like someone had turned the volume down on my life. But slowly, day by day, things began to settle. I went back to work. I started running again in the mornings. I forced myself to leave the apartment instead of sitting there replaying old memories. And sometimes, without meaning to, I found myself thinking about the woman from the restaurant. Not in a romantic way. At least, that's what I told myself. It was just the way she had spoken to me that night. Calm. Honest. Like someone who understood exactly how heavy that moment had been. I wondered about her sometimes. But I didn't know her last name. Or where she worked. Or if I would ever see her again. Life has a strange sense of timing though. About 3 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, I stopped by a small bookstore cafe a few blocks from my apartment. It had become one of the few places where I could sit for an hour without thinking too much. The smell of coffee and old books filled the air as I stepped inside. I ordered a latte and turned toward the seating area, and froze. She was sitting by the window. A book rested open in her hands, sunlight spilling across the table in front of her. For a second I wondered if I was imagining things. Then she looked up. Recognition spread across her face almost instantly. "Well," she said with a small smile, closing the book. "I guess the universe decided we should run into each other again." I couldn't help smiling back. "I guess it did." I walked over and stood beside her table. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" She gestured to the chair across from her. Of course. Up close, she looked just as composed as I remembered. Today her hair was loosely tied back, and she wore a soft gray sweater that made her look relaxed and approachable. "How have you been holding up?" she asked. The question wasn't casual. She genuinely wanted to know. I shrugged lightly. "Better than I expected, honestly." She nodded, like that answer made sense. They talked for a while, longer than either of them planned. The conversation flowed easily this time. Work. Books. Travel. The strange ways life changes direction when you least expect it. At one point we both reached for the sugar jar at the same time. Our fingers brushed lightly. Neither of us pulled away right away. It was a small moment, but it lingered just long enough to make us both smile. As the afternoon stretched on, I noticed something else. The way she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The warmth in her laugh. The comfortable silence that occasionally settled between us without feeling awkward. Eventually I realized nearly 2 hours had passed. When we finally stood to leave, we walked toward the door together. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. She paused before heading in the opposite direction. "Well," she said, folding her arms lightly, "this was a nice surprise." "Yeah," I admitted. "It was." There was a brief moment of hesitation. Then she smiled again. "Maybe we'll run into each other here again sometime." I nodded. "Maybe we will." But as I walked home that evening, I had a quiet feeling that neither of us really believed it would be just coincidence next time. Over the next couple of months, the bookstore cafe quietly became our place. At first, the meetings felt accidental. Then they became something we both expected. Every Saturday afternoon, one of us would show up first and claim the small table by the window. The sunlight always fell across the same corner of the table, warming the wood, and somehow the conversation always picked up right where it had left off the week before. We talked about everything. Work frustrations. Books we were reading. Small childhood stories that normally never come up in everyday conversation. She had a way of listening that made you feel completely heard. When I spoke, she didn't interrupt or rush to respond. She just watched me carefully, her expression soft but attentive. And sometimes I caught myself noticing things I probably shouldn't have been noticing. The way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. The calm confidence in the way she carried herself. The gentle warmth in her voice whenever she said my name. She was different from anyone I had ever known. Older, yes, but not in the way people usually meant. She simply seemed steadier. More certain of herself. One evening, after the cafe closed early for a private event, we decided to take a walk instead. The sky was deep blue, the city lights beginning to glow as the sun disappeared. The air carried that cool evening breeze that makes you instinctively slow your pace. We wandered through a quiet park nearby, the gravel path crunching softly beneath our shoes. For a while, neither of us said much. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. But it was heavier than usual. Eventually we found an empty bench near a small fountain and sat down. The sound of water trickling through the fountain filled the quiet space between us. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. "I need to admit something," I said after a moment. She turned toward me, curious but calm. "What is it?" I stared down at my hands for a second before answering. "I think I'm still afraid." Her voice softened. "Afraid of what?" I exhaled slowly. "Trusting someone again." The words felt heavier once they were out loud. For a long time I thought my marriage was solid. I thought I understood the person I was building my life with. I paused. Now I'm not sure how I missed something so big. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply reached over and placed her hand gently on mine. Her touch was warm and steady. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just there. Her thumb brushed slowly across the back of my hand in a quiet, reassuring motion. "You didn't miss something," she said softly. "You trusted someone." I glanced up at her. She held my gaze for a moment before looking down at our hands. "Can I be honest about something too?" she added. "Of course." A faint, almost shy smile appeared on her face. "After my divorce, I stopped believing certain things were possible." I tilted my head slightly. "Like what?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Like someone younger ever seeing me as more than a passing conversation." Her honesty caught me off guard. She looked up again, her expression vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. For a moment neither of us spoke. The night air moved gently around us, the fountain still whispering quietly nearby. Without thinking too much about it, I turned my hand slightly so my fingers closed around hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her grip tightened just a little. and for the first time since my marriage had ended. Hope didn't feel like such a dangerous thing to believe in again. By the time winter began settling over the city, our quiet routine had grown into something neither of us tried to define anymore. We still met at the bookstore cafe sometimes. We still went on long walks when the evenings were clear. And little by little, being around her started to feel like the most natural part of my life. But despite the closeness that had grown between us, neither of us had crossed that invisible line yet. Not fully. There were moments, of course. Moments where the silence lingered a little longer than usual. Moments where our hands brushed and stayed together. Moments where our eyes held on to each other just a second too long. But we both understood there were things we hadn't said out loud yet. And maybe we were both a little afraid of what would change once we did. One evening, a mutual friend of hers invited us to a small dinner gathering. It wasn't anything formal, just a handful of people around a long table, warm lights hanging overhead, the smell of homemade food filling the room. Most of the people there already knew her. They didn't know me. But the introductions were easy, the conversation relaxed. At some point during dinner, someone jokingly asked how long we had been together. The question hung in the air for a second. I felt her glance toward me. There was no embarrassment in her expression, just a quiet awareness of the moment. I smiled lightly. "We're still figuring that out," I said. The table laughed, and the conversation moved on. But something about that moment stayed with both of us. Later that night, we left the gathering together and started walking down the quiet street toward our cars. The city felt calm. Streetlights cast soft circles of golden light across the sidewalk, and the cold air carried the faint smell of rain. For a while we walked side by side without speaking. Then she slowed slightly. "I've been thinking about something," she said. I looked over at her. "What's that?" She hesitated, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. "About us." The way she said it made my chest tighten just a little. "I know we haven't really defined what this is," she continued. "And part of me likes that. It's been easy." She stopped walking. I turned toward her. "But there's another part of me that worries," she admitted. "Worries about what?" She looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "The difference in our lives. Our ages. What people might think." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the vulnerability underneath it. I stepped a little closer to her. "Do you care what they think?" I asked gently. She gave a soft, thoughtful smile. "I care about you not regretting it someday." For a moment I just looked at her. Then I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool from the night air, but they curled naturally around mine. "I've spent months getting to know you," I said quietly. "Not your age. Not other people's opinions. Just you." The tension in her shoulders softened slightly. We stood there under the streetlight, close enough to feel each other's warmth in the cold air. Slowly, she lifted her free hand and brushed her fingertips lightly along my cheek. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant. But it carried months of unspoken emotion. Before I could overthink the moment, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. The hug was warm and lingering. I could feel her head resting lightly against my shoulder. My arms closed around her naturally. For a long moment neither of us moved. Then, softly, I pressed a small kiss against her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh, the kind that comes when something finally feels right. And standing there beneath the streetlight, it felt like the line we had been carefully avoiding had finally disappeared. Expand Keynote 7, 500 Words, Part 7, Choosing each other a year can change more than you expect. Sometimes I think back to the night I sat in my car across the street from that restaurant, staring at the door and wondering whether I should walk inside. At the time, it felt like the edge of something terrible. And in many ways, it was. My marriage ended. The life I thought I had carefully built cracked apart in a single evening. For a while afterward, I wasn't sure what the future was supposed to look like anymore. but life has a strange way of rebuilding itself. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just one quiet moment at a time. These days, my mornings look very different. Most weekends begin with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the apartment while sunlight spills across the kitchen counter. She's usually the first one awake, standing by the window with a mug in her hands, her hair still slightly messy from sleep. When I walk into the kitchen, she always glances over her shoulder and smiles. It's a small moment. But somehow it feels bigger than the dramatic kind of happiness people always talk about. It feels real. We never rushed anything after that night under the streetlight. There were still conversations we needed to have. About expectations. About the age difference. About the way people sometimes looked at us with quiet curiosity when we walked into a room together. But those conversations never turned into problems. If anything, they brought us closer. Because neither of us pretended the relationship was simple. We just decided it was worth choosing anyway. One evening not long ago, we found ourselves walking down the same downtown street where everything had started. The same restaurant still stood on the corner, its windows glowing with that familiar warm light. She noticed it at the same moment I did. "Well," she said softly, folding her arms as we paused outside, "that place holds some interesting memories for you." I let out a quiet laugh. That's one way to put it. For a moment we both just looked through the window. Couples sat at small tables inside, talking quietly, the same clinking glasses and low music drifting out every time the door opened. Then she glanced at me. "What do you think?" she asked. "About what?" "About changing the memory." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we go in there?" Her smile held a playful challenge. "Why not?" A year ago, the thought would have made my stomach twist. But now, it just felt like another step forward. So we walked inside together. The warmth of the restaurant wrapped around us immediately, just like it had that night. But this time everything felt different. We weren't standing in the middle of a broken moment. We were walking toward a new one. The host led us to a small table near the window. As we sat down, she reached across the table and rested her hand lightly on top of mine. The gesture felt natural. Unforced. Her thumb brushed gently against my fingers as she smiled. "See," she said softly. "Much better memory." I looked at her for a moment. Then I squeezed her hand. And as the candlelight flickered gently between us, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes the worst night of your life isn't the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of the right one.